This is Michael Ostrolenk. Welcome to O Radio, where we explore individual and social transformation through collaborative action. I'm a psychotherapist with a transpersonal and somatic specialization. I'm also a transpartisan social entrepreneur and head instructor at SEALFIT's Unbeatable Mind Academy and executive coach at Spartan 7. Today's show is brought to you by Casper Scafidi. He's an amazing body worker located in the Northern Virginia area. He has integrated different somatic practices into his work, including biodynamic and mechanical cranial therapies, visceral manipulation, as well as neuromuscular and myofascial approaches into his Rolfing work. You can learn more about Casper at www.casperscafidi.com. That's COSPERSCAFIDI.com. Today's guest is Jim Turner. Jim is a lawyer in the DC metro area who has worked on health and food freedom issues since the late 1960s. He wrote The Chemical Feast, the Nader Report on the Food and Drug Administration, and co-authored with Lori Chickering, Voice of the People, the Transpartisan Imperative in American Life. Mr. Turner is the president of the National Institute for Science, Law, and Public Policy, a nonprofit organization that conducts research, publishing, and demonstration programs in urban agriculture and food policy. Among its publications are a food policy newsletter called Healthy Harvest News, Healthy Harvest, a global directory of sustainable agriculture. Jim also served on the National Commission for the Certification of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine for 10 years, including 5 years as vice chairman. He serves as chairperson of the Maryland Institute of Traditional Chinese Medicine. He also successfully petitioned the FDA for the legalization of acupuncture needles, and has represented mercury-free dentists before licensing boards in several states. Mr. Turner now serves as board chairman for Citizens for Health. I first met Jim through his partner Betsy in, I think, about 2001, thanks to my meeting Betsy at Ken Wilber's Integral Institute. And ever since 2001, Jim has been a colleague, a friend, and a mentor of mine. Jim, good to see you again.
Likewise, good to see you, Michael.
So, over the last almost 20 years, we've worked on dozens of different projects. But today I kind of want to highlight a few of the things that we recently spoke about that you're working on. 3 of them in general. And I know that you'll kind of connect the dots, and I'm sure there's other
projects. If you don't get the one I want to talk about in the top 3, I'll talk about that anyway.
Well, in that case, let's start with that. What would you like to first talk about?
I'm just going to mark it, and then we can get to your 3, but just be sure we don't miss this one. And that is that yesterday, Lori Chickering and I, who were he's the co-author of the Voice of the People that you mentioned, and he is with myself co-executive editor and founder of the Transpartisan Review. And we yesterday attended a day-long session, a half-day-long session with the Quincy Institute on Foreign Policy, which is actually talking in terms of being transpartisan, looking for a new foreign policy. It was very impressive, and the thing that got our attention and brought us there, where they had General Protea speaking and Bo Rana speaking, and a whole range of very interesting people from Congress, Bernie Sanders, foreign policy person, and so forth, all talking about a new transpartisan, they use the word transpartisan foreign policy. It's funded by the Koch Foundation and the Soros Foundation jointly. So as a unit, it's a very interesting thing. And you were the person that introduced us, Lori and I, to Trita Parsi, who's the executive vice president of that group. So it was an extremely interesting thing. And maybe later on in our talk, in our conversation, we can talk a little bit about what happened.
That'd be fantastic. Well, let's definitely make sure we have some time for that.
I just wanted to be sure that was in the top 3 that we're going to talk about.
It's the top 4 now.
Okay, great.
And we'll include the Quincy Institute and a transpartisan approach to U.S. foreign policy, which obviously is much needed these days. But in terms of your background, thinking and training and work, a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it is in food and health-related issues. So why don't we kind of start there? One of the issues that you and I have talked about recently, one of them are vaccine-related issues. One of them is homeopathy, and one of them is 5G, the new technology. Where would you like to start as kind of the entry point into your broader worldview, your kind of transpartisan analysis of these issues, and how
Well,
Americans should think about
well, the transpartisan argument or observation, I think of it as an analytical tool, looks at the political debates that are underway and argues, and we observe and point to the fact that we look at everything as bifurcated. It's got a two-sided framework, left, right. But as soon as you do that, you create trouble for trying to resolve any issue. So what we've done is we've borrowed and created what we call the borrowed information, created something we call the transpartisan matrix, which is a left-right analysis on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis, it's freedom and order. And what we're saying is that 100% of all people are on that matrix somewhere at any given moment. By the way, they move every moment. It's an undulating dynamic. But there are people at the free right, free left, order right, and order left, and they work to come up with solutions or observations or analysis or explanations, whatever, in that context. And that's what we write about in the Transpartisan Review, and we write about that in the Voice of the People, and we talked about that yesterday at this meeting. Now, you ask, how do we enter the three issues that you raised? Take food safety. I got into the food safety question by virtue of meeting with Ralph Nader in 1968 and having a discussion saying that auto safety, which he was being known for then, was in his writings an example of a breakdown of decision-making in the culture. The decision-making, the policy decision-making was being dominated, in his view, by concentrated economic interests. And the result was that the full public interest or consumer interest, those were two different interests, but they weren't included in the primary way that decisions were being made. That was his basic argument. And that took about 2 pages in his writings to say. And then he used the example of the auto industry and said, look, it's really bad. Everybody who was in the media and who was political and so forth looked at that as a critique of the auto industry. I was assigned the task in law school to study this with a bunch of other folks to study auto safety. And I said, wait a minute, he's talking about the way our decisions are made. And he's using the auto safety as an example. So my objective then, what I did then was to go to, it took me a long time to get hold of him. We met in Washington. I explained what I've just said. And he said, what would you do about it? I said, well, if you're right, any market we look at should be like that. And so we kicked around, what should we talk about? And ultimately, what should we look at? And ultimately, we decided to look at food. And the idea was that, food fell into the same category. So I said food. And he said, food, that's great. I was the cook in the Army for 6 months. And I thought that was a fascinating piece of information to know about Ralph Nader. But in that situation now, if you pick up a food safety question, you'll find that the FDA, and this applies to drugs, it applies to vaccines, it applies to every issue that we have on the health side, and and frankly everything, energy, housing, all of it. But with the FDA, and FDA is a regulatory agency. There are about 55 regulatory agencies in the U.S. government, and they're and they regulate industries like the FAA. By the way, if you want to see the problem, look at the Boeing. At Boeing, you'll see the same problem right there. If you want to see the problem in any area, you'll find it. Food. The FDA is told. The FDA is told by Congress, take the food supply, multi-billion-dollar food supply, and divide it into 2 categories. One category, safe, valuable, effective, good. Other category, bad, terrible, harmful. Draw a line and divide it into those 2 things. And everything falls either in this one or this one. Once you do that, you're doomed. You can't possibly come up with an answer, because there are a bunch of things that are obviously okay. And there are a bunch of things that are obviously a problem. And the result is that nobody ever fights about those. There is, however, this huge thing in the core among food and drug lawyers. It's called the gray area. And that place is where all the battles go on. And the battles are very simple. first battle that comes up is the FDA says anything that's in the gray area, we're going to treat as unsafe or bad or wrong. And you've got to prove that it's not. The other teams, all the other teams are saying, wait a minute, our thing's not unsafe. You can't prove it's unsafe. Our thing has got value. Our thing is, it doesn't cause harm, so forth. And then the battles go around these 2 points. And the real issue that comes up is, what's the choice of the consumer? Now, when do you say the consumer can't have a choice? That's a very important political question. It's a policy question. Basically, our culture says consumers, voters, citizens have the maximum amount of choice that the society can sustain. The regulators want to minimize the amount of choice. That's the struggle. But no single battle is ever fought on that struggle. It's always fought on the particular transactional issue about a specific things. Is a sweetener safe or not safe? Is a food additive safe or not safe? Is a drug safe or not safe? And then there are all kinds of structures built around it that account for the fact that there's no answer to those questions. And we get into these huge battles. So let's just take the vaccine battle.
Please.
Okay, so you've got right now, let's use the state of California because it's the most radical on this. They're mandating roughly 70 vaccines for every child by the time they reach maybe 7th grade, maybe 5th grade, maybe a 2nd grade. It depends on they're too big. It's about 70 different injection frameworks. Now they have so there are a lot of issues that emerge, like let's take something like the MMR vaccine. There are parents who say, I would like to have them separated. I'd like to, and by the way, it's all on a schedule that's set up by the CDC, and then California just adopts it by law, or by regulation. But they have 10 vaccines that are required. 3 of them are the MMR, that's the measles, mumps, and rubella. Those are 3 vaccines required. And some families are saying, well, there's evidence in the data that if you take them together, you're more likely to be harmed than if you take them separately. We would like the option to be able to take them separately. And the law says, no, you can't do that. There's a vaccine, which is the DPT, the diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus. And some people are saying, well, maybe we would like to avoid the pertussis because there is evidence in the record that the pertussis vaccine actually is spreading pertussis rather than stopping pertussis. It's a big debate in science. I'm not saying it is or isn't, but I'm saying there's a debate. So some parents are saying, we would like to have our kids not take the pertussis, but they're not allowed to under the law. If they don't take it, they can't go to school. I mean, that's the way it's structured. Or there are people who say, well, all these contagious vaccines are really, really serious, and we've got to do it, and that's why we have to mandate it. But some people are saying, but wait a minute, the tetanus vaccine tetanus isn't contagious. It's not a contagious disease, so why do I have to take the tetanus shot? And one of the things that comes up when that's raised is that the way they're doing the shots now, a pregnant woman is being recommended to take the DPT more frequently than the guidelines are for taking the tetanus shot. So and on each one of the vaccines, there's a series of discussions like this. And the idea that issues aren't black and white, they are nuanced, brings into the picture is that individual consumers should have the right to make a choice. And what's fascinating is that we need vaccines, maybe. I mean, there's an argument that it's certainly a legitimate, supportable argument that we need vaccines. But there's an added argument that's made, which is not a legitimate argument. And that is that they are shown to be completely, unequivocally safe. Basically, the argument is that nobody is going to be injured by these vaccines. And certainly that's the impression that's created. And yet the federal government has paid more than $4 billion to families whose children and some adults have been harmed by vaccines. So you can't say, however important you argue that the vaccines are, you cannot say they don't have any side effects. They are not harmful. They will not kill some children. You can't say that. So then the question becomes, who gets to make the choice of which children are going to put in the way of a vaccine danger? And that's the public policy issue that needs to be addressed. And it cannot be addressed by a bifurcated issue. You must or you can't. It can't do that. You must take the vaccine or you can't take the vaccine are the two positions that are not defensible. So anyway, that's an entry into the vaccine issue using that same bifurcated argument.
Let me ask you this. So when they do the safety testing for vaccines, do they test the multitude of vaccines that are given to a child or a baby? Or are they just testing one at a time? So they might not even know the negative consequences of up to 70 vaccines over a certain period of time.
They do not test them as a unit. They don't test the whole set. They only and actually there's some concern about whether they actually test them adequately at all, because no vaccines, apparently, it looks like from the data, it looks like no vaccines have ever been tested against what they do is they test them against other chemicals. They don't test vaccinated children versus non-vaccinated children. They don't measure that. So we don't have, apparently they don't have data on what happens to children that don't get vaccinated versus what happens to children that do get vaccinated. They also, vaccines do not go through the Food and Drug Administration new drug application process. They go through a public health service process, which is a different process. And there are structures that are designed to make that be palatable, but it is not the same as a drug. And so technically each batch of vaccine is supposed to be tested to be sure that it isn't going to cause harm. They test it in animals to make sure that it doesn't cause harm. But there's no comparison, apparently, at least we haven't found any, of vaccinated versus non-vaccinated children.
Is the standard going through this public health model the same as if you went through the drug model?
It's not the same. They're different. Whether it's weaker or stronger or not is a matter of debate. The reason that the Public Health Service Act included vaccines was to promote the use of vaccines. That was what it was for. And as the law began to unfold, starting in the late 70s, mid 70s, there were so many lawsuits against vaccines that the vaccine manufacturers began to say maybe they wouldn't produce any vaccines any longer. And so at that point, some special laws were involved in the vaccine community. Vaccine companies were absolved of having to worry about lawsuits. They basically have no liability. So if they do cause harm, that's considered to be not a problem. For these payments that are paid to the children or their families, that's a special court, not a particularly visible court, that makes the decision, and they make the decision on the basis of some express rules that say if these things happen to you within the period of time after the vaccine is given, we will compensate you. But
do the vaccine manufacturers pay into this fund, or is this a taxpayer fund?
The price of a vaccine includes 75 cents for each dose goes into that fund. It's spent about $4 billion so far since 1988, and it has about that much in the fund right now, ready to be spent.
So one of the things I'm hearing you say is that there's no comparison between unvaccinated children for a particular type of vaccine and illness and vaccinated children in particular vaccine, particular illness. How come they don't use like the Amish? Because aren't the Amish a group of people who do not vaccinate their children? Would be a great way to test the efficacy and safety.
Well, yeah, and actually you wouldn't even have to do anything. You just collect the data. You know, how many Amish children get the measles even though they're not vaccinated?
Yeah.
And that data, we cannot find that data anywhere having been effectively collected and used in the process that designs the vaccine policy.
What's the arguments for the pro-vaccine people, the doctors and the scientists and the public policy and regulators people, for not wanting to compare and contrast vaccinated versus unvaccinated for a particular vaccine and particular illness or
I
disease?
best to ask them. I don't quite understand why they don't, but their basic argument is that they've established safety by testing each vaccine specifically. There are some problems with that are troubling in that, for example, in the measles outbreaks that led to the California mandate law, there were a significant percentage of people who got measles who had been vaccinated. So
Okay.
that raises a serious question. You know, some percentage, maybe 25, 30% of the people who actually got the measles had been vaccinated. So that poses an interesting question as to, and that's one of the reasons why testing in non-vaccinated people, that is measuring the data for non-vaccinated versus vaccinated, would be a sensible course of action. But there's a lot of, that's not happened. I mean, exactly why it's unclear, but it would be a good idea to do that.
Is there a school of thought with maybe evolutionary biology where it might be useful for some portion of the public to actually get some of these diseases because it might protect them from other longer-term chronic illnesses? Has that ever been explored?
Well, there is data. It's very interesting data. Children that get the chickenpox, which is not a terribly serious disease, have lifetime immunity. But if you get the vaccine, it's not lifetime immunity, and so that raises a question. And there are a lot of arguments that need to be looked at from a scientific point of view, like whether or not having gotten chickenpox as a child, you're more or less protected from shingles. It's quite possible that the vaccine effect that you get from natural chickenpox may provide you with more protection against the shingles than getting a shingle shot. And again, I want to make it very clear, these are areas that need to be looked at. And our point is that you should not, that the ultimate decision maker on what gets injected into your body ought to be you. And for your children, it ought to be you for your children. And that should not be overridden except in case of a major problem of some kind. There has to be a finding somewhere. Somebody's got to say, this is a pandemic, or say whatever they're going to say. And now you can mandate vaccines. That's not in the structure right now. Right now, there's no trigger that says you must take the vaccine. It's just a flat out law in California, and they're trying to get it in for pretty much every state. The law says you are required to have this vaccination or you can't go to school.
For some states, California included until recently, you would have philosophical and religious exemptions. Is that how it worked?
Well, California, from 1961 to 2015, had the most friendly consumer decision law on vaccines. It was passed in 1961 in regard to the safe and oral vaccine. At that point, they had a program that even where there were mandated vaccines, an individual could say, I don't want to take it. And that was the law up until 2015. California has gotten, I don't know why they got all excited in 2015, but there were arguments that not enough vaccination was going on in the schools because they only had something like 94% vaccination rate. And we're saying that's above what they claim is necessary for herd immunity, to the extent that that is a sound concept. That's above that amount. That is, they had a better vaccination rate. Well, then they came back and said, well, yes, but there are some schools that have lower than that. And then they had these outbreaks of measles that they pointed to. They were relatively minor outbreaks of measles. But the main reason you do vaccination is to make sure that even if there's a minor outbreak, it doesn't spread. But the problem that was involved, as I said earlier, is that measles, people that got the measles vaccine, some of the people that got the measles, some of them, a significant number, over 30%, I believe, from the data that I've seen, actually were vaccinated and still got the measles. The problem is this is all complex stuff. I mean, for example, there's a condition that comes from taking the measles vaccine for a very small number of people have the measles antibody circulating naturally. And a very small number of those who are vaccinated end up getting a very serious fatal disease called the subacute sclerosing panencephalitis. Doesn't mean much to anybody except when, as we did, had a family with a child who took about 3 years to die from this disease, died when he was 12. They knew from the time he was 9 that he was going to die by the time he was 15. And that came directly from a vaccination. Yeah, it's a small number of people, very, very, very small, but very, very serious for the families that are involved. So what our proposal there that we made was, why not have anyone who gets the measles vaccine be tested for circulating antibody before they get the shot? First of all, if you've got circulating antibody, you don't get more protection by getting them vaccinated. You've got it already. And then if you have circulating antibody, you have a very small chance of getting a fatal disease. So, a family could seriously get circulating antibody, and get an antibody test and find out are they taking a risk or not. That's the kind of thing we mean by saying vaccine choice. People need to have the ability to look into these things. And all 10 of the mandated vaccines in California have issues that would cause someone to want to sit down and think through the pros and cons of taking the vaccine.
Just for clarity's sake, so there are 10 that are mandated in California, but I heard you say in the number 70 there in total.
There are 10 entities, 10 agents.
Okay.
And then those agents are given more than one time.
Okay.
And they're repeated over time, and that's how many injections that it's estimated they'll get. Incidentally, that total of 70 is not necessarily, there are other vaccines people might be taking at the same time that would be counted as a part of that 10, potentially. Okay. As a part of that 70, potentially.
Can you speak to two things just for education of the listening audience? You mentioned herd mentality, herd immunity, because that seems to be an argument in favor of mandating vaccines. Can you speak to what that means?
Well, the herd immunity argument in general is that there's a certain point when if everybody, let's say for the moment, let's say immunity is the goal. We want to have people who are immune. And if a large enough percentage of the herd, whatever that is, the herd reaches that level of immunity, then the disease will not be able to spread. There are two issues on a disease. One is getting it, and the other is, does it spread? So the theory is if there's a catchment area that's covered so that you can't spread it, because the people have enough immunity to protect against it spreading, that if you can't get the disease because you've got immunity, then if the percentage is high enough, then you can have an agent break out in that herd, but it won't spread because it's not fertile ground for it. And so the issue is, what is that percentage? And it's 90% seems to be a pretty good number, 90, maybe 95%. Some people who want more herd immunity would argue 95 or 96%. 94% isn't enough. And again, one of our arguments is that going from 94 to 96 should not be justified to force people to do it. And there's another underlying premise here that's extremely important, and we're going to see it now that this unfolds. There are two of them, actually. One is that all these mandates are for children. And so you've got a herd, but the herd is made up of adults as well as children. I mean, if whoever lives in a city or on a street or in a house, it's not just children. So you can have immunity for the children, and that will perhaps, given everything, protect that child. It does not necessarily protect the herd because of all the people who are adults who are not in that vaccinated pool. And then the argument that's made is that what's happening is there's now a recommended schedule for adults, and they're moving in the direction of mandating adult vaccines. Can't have a passport, can't get a driver's license, so forth, things like that. They're not doing it. That is, they haven't proposed those things yet. They've just hinted around at them. But you can't really create real herd immunity in a community that only vaccinates children. The second, well, go ahead.
No. Well, let me ask
Well,
you.
the second issue is and we have a lot of viral disease issues developing, and the coronavirus is just one, but there's Ebola and others that are going on in Africa. Right now in Africa, there's serious problems with Ebola. And the most important point that's being made by the public health people in Africa working on Ebola is that the #1 tool to stop the spread of one of these diseases is community confidence in the public health people. Community confidence, the ability of the community to believe what they're being told by the doctors, the public health doctors. In the Congo, in central Congo, I think it was central, maybe on eastern Congo, but in any case, in the Congo, the UN took doctors in and they blocked all the various alternative medicine folks who say they have something that will build immunity. And the community started blocking the doctors because a lot of the things that they were comfortable with using and were part of their medicine were being blocked by the UN, and they were trying to push vaccines in and other things. And some of the leadership is saying, wait a minute, we have to have the support of the community in order to make these things stop. And I think we're going to see that in the coronavirus as it unfolds. The best way to stop these viral diseases is by having the community support the behaviors, whatever they may be, support the behaviors of the public health service. And that takes a lot of work, and mandating is a shortcut to getting people to take vaccines.
Are there any scientists who are critical of the concept of herd immunity, or is that kind of settled?
Dozens.
Okay.
It's a huge, interesting scientific debate, and all that we say from Citizens for Health and from our groups is consumers should be involved in that debate. They should be allowed to make a choice in that debate, and we think that you must have informed consent, and that's the law. Everybody says informed consent, and you can't have informed consent without choice. There's no if you got all the information in the world, but when you're all done, you have to do the same thing you would have done if you had no information. You have not effectively actually addressed the issue of consent, informed consent. So that's a serious problem that needs to be addressed. This goes back to the whole point that I was making at the beginning about how policy decisions are made. You cannot make policy decisions by having the order side of the debate tell the freedom side of the debate to shut up and sit down, because all that will happen is it will create a backlash that will undermine whatever the order team is saying. And that's true on both the left and the right, because you've got freedom right people known as libertarians. You got freedom left people known as basically they're cultural outliers in a sense. They don't believe that they should do whatever the government tells them. They're on the left, they're on the right. And interestingly enough, if you run the statistics from the last Obama, not the Obama election, but the Trump election, you'll see that there's a huge category of a huge set where people voted for Obama, or where districts voted for Obama and then voted for Trump. And there are 6 to 9 million individual voters that, if you tote them up for each election in the same district, there were 6 to 9 million differential that suggested people voting for Obama and then voting for Trump. That statistic, and by the way, Trump won the election by basically 77,000 votes in a handful of districts. That's how the Electoral College was managed. And there's a whole question about what it means that these districts that went by 6 million votes for Obama ended up going by 6 to 9 million votes the other way in the Trump period. What is that? Why is that happening? And we think it's what we would call the transpartisan constituency. That's a group of people who vote more for their stuff than they do, their individual stuff, than they do for any party stuff. And by the way, in the country, 70% of eligible voters under the Constitution do not identify with either the Republican or the Democratic Party. Now, I'm saying, when I talked about vaccines, I'm saying that that shows up in the vaccine debate. It's showing up already in the, you mentioned 5G as an issue, showing up in 5G. Already there are groups that are forming all across the country resisting forcing 5G onto the communities across the country. And
before we get to the 5G, let me just ask a couple of questions,
sure.
kind of transition out of the vaccines to the broader question of order and freedom. So would you, the left freedom folks, are those like the Paul Ray cultural creative types? Is that maybe
that seems to be very close to it? And he identifies as about he says 50 million, but when you actually do the data, you're probably talking about 29 million people in his data. That was back when he did it in around 2000. Probably there's a larger number, but cultural creatives, you could call them as kind of like the free left, although cultural creatives do include a number of libertarian right folks.
Yeah, half my friends. So let me ask you this. It's interesting because when you look at, because we're now into the election cycle, all the Democrats are running against Trump. There's no one really competing against Trump in the Republican Party, so it's going to be Trump against whomever. When you listen to the debates, when you listen to the ads, when you listen to the talking heads, I don't hear anything on the freedom side, freedom right or freedom left side. It seemingly is all out of the order side. Why do you think that, if I'm correct, and maybe I'm wrong, the free left, free right is not part of the conversation? Am I missing something?
Government is an order institution. Everybody who signs up for government is an order person.
Okay.
Now, I want to make it very, very clear that the matrix that I'm talking about is inside every individual.
Okay.
So a person is not necessarily free to right, and therefore you can predict them on any given issue. So you'll see across the board, you will see people saying, for example, I'm a social liberal, but I'm a fiscal conservative. Well, when they're a social liberal, that's their free self announcing itself. When they're a fiscal conservative, that's their order side. And by the way, that can come on the right too. You can have, I remember we put a meeting together between classical liberals and libertarians, and the libertarian guy said, well, we're the party for hot pistols and prostitution.
That was David.
If you were to take, for example, the Koch brothers' positions on issues like gay marriage and a whole range of social issues, if you just listed that and said, we don't know who this is, but we're going to list this stuff, they would look like this there on the left. Because they have a social liberal, if you call it. See, we don't. Lori and I don't believe there's any such thing as a liberal and a conservative. We think those are made up labels that are put on people after they make their choices. And so what you're having is as the culture gets more and more individualized, more and more people are able to express more and more of their own personal identities. And what it turns out is that on some things there would be quote, quote, liberal, and some things are conservative. And then they start expressing it, and pretty soon the whole thing is going around like this. Now, if you go freedom order, people who are interested in government, who want to be involved in government, who want to make policy for it, tend to be on the order side. People who want to live free and not be suppressed and want to make their own choices tend to be on the free side. And it's very, it's unique. I mean, there is a tendency for the people who like freedom to let the guys who like order fight about it. But when it gets as bad as it is right now, I mean, basically Trump's got, if you really, really get right down to it, in terms of the entire potential electorate, he probably doesn't have more than 25 or 30% support. Interestingly enough, neither did Obama. It's very interesting. They have roughly the same amount of public support, but that's not what the polls are on. The polls are on who voted, who's going to vote, who voted last time, who thinks they're going to vote. If you're an independent, are you more likely to vote liberal or conservative? That's the way, or Democrat or Republican. That's the way they're talked about. It's always talked in that bifurcation. Just like in the vaccine case, there's very little I'll give you a perfect example. Nevada has a none of the above ballot.
Did they really?
None of the above ballot. You can go into any election in Nevada and you can check none of the above. I have never seen a poll that measures how many people are planning to vote none of the above.
Okay.
Now there may be in Nevada, but I've never seen them, and they don't play a role. If you look at the primaries, essentially the primaries, except for the new ones like they're going on in California, exclude anybody who's not a Democrat or a Republican.
Yeah.
Exclude them. They can't vote. Fusion tickets are illegal all across the country except New York. You know, New York, the only reason Bloomberg's in politics today is because they had more ballot lines than Democrat and Republican. So he's a Democrat and he couldn't get the nomination of the Democratic Party, so he went to one of the third parties, got that nomination, and then got the Republicans to endorse that. That's how he got to be mayor of New York. And then he's now got a political career and he's going to run for president. There are two guys in the Democratic primary. Here are all these Democrats running around saying, you're not a Democrat, you're not a Democrat, you're not a Democrat, therefore you should vote. Who are they talking to? There are two guys running, Sanders and Bloomberg, who are neither Democrats nor Republicans. I mean, Sanders, his entire life has not been a Democrat. He's still not a Democrat.
Right.
I don't think he'll ever be a Democrat. He's talking to the public. He's talking to the Democratic public, the people who are out there who want to choose president. Bloomberg was Republican mayor of New York, 3 terms as a Republican mayor, and now he's running in the Democratic primary. He's a guy who's standing up and saying, I'm not a Democrat or Republican either. Now they're forced to run in the Democratic primary because there's no other place for them to go. The structure of that is that the 70% of the public that doesn't identify as either Republican or Democrat is now looking to them and saying, well, they're people that aren't the Republicans, they aren't the Democrats. And it's really funny, you know, I saw Biden on the TV the other day saying, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Democrat. I figured every time he said that, he made votes for Bernie.
Mm-hmm. You started talking about 5G, but before we get there, it just struck me it might be of value to take an issue and run it through the matrix. Short issue, not short, but you know, really clear issue. And what crossed my mind is pornography.
Mm-hmm.
And if you could just walk through like what the order left, the order right, the free left, how they might think about the pornography as an issue and address it.
Well, pornography is the #1 thing selling on the internet.
Yeah,
the internet is the biggest market ever created, and there's nobody going to be effectively politically attacking pornography. It's not going to happen. If you do, you're gone. So they're going to have to. So basically, that's an issue that the free right and the free right and the free left are both against laws banning pornography.
So would the free right say it's economic freedom, and the free left would say it's a expression of one's sexuality? I mean, is that
the general thing that happens is that the free rights argument is we don't want anybody messing in our economic lives. They basically don't want anybody messing in any of their lives. But the right tends to say, from the free side, they don't want people messing with our personal lives. But the order side of the right says we do.
Yep. So
the order side of right wants to ban pornography. It wants to ban abortions. It wants to ban all the time. Ironically, the right is much more upset about mandatory vaccination than the left. So you have the order left running around saying you got to have vaccination, and the order right and free right are saying no, you can't, no, you can't. And the free left saying no, you can't. So there's a dynamic there. But anyway, I'll tell you the way the pornography issue gets misunderstood in the society. They quote Justice Stewart saying in a big pornography case, he said, I know pornography when I see it. And everybody goes around saying, that's subjective, it's not meaningful, yada, yada, and I know pornography when I see it. What he actually said was, it's a case, he's looking at a case. I know pornography when I see it, and this isn't it. Now, the this isn't it category is the category where if you're trying to divide the world into A and minus A, this isn't it, it's the place that's in between. It's enshrined in the law in one place, which is in the Scottish verdict. The Scottish verdict goes guilty, guilty, not proven to be guilty, not guilty. So there's an intermediate category. The not proven to be guilty it has the same practical effect, but it's a different structure. So my point is that, like you're saying, the free left, free right, order freedom, order left on the pornography issue. Right now, I don't think there's any traction for the pornography question in politics. There is traction on anti-abortion, and there is traction on attempting to move opposition to birth control into that category.
But just for like understanding the matrix sake, so would the order right on pornography argue against it on religious grounds? As an example, the order left would argue against it on demeaning of women, objectifying women, as an example. I mean, is that like how this?
That'll be an example. That's an example.
Okay.
But there's a whole argument in the pornography world debate of women saying banning the adult sex trafficking, not trafficking, but adult sex participation demeans women, because women have the ability to have the agency to make the choice about how they want to live their lives. They're not harming anybody as long as consent's involved and so forth. It's up to them to make their own decisions. So you have, and it's not at all clear. It's not at all clear how the freedom order piece fights there or lives there, because it's a funny thing about the law, because there's a whole thing about decriminalizing stuff, which is different than making it legal. Mm-hmm. So we went through the whole thing of decriminalizing marijuana until it got to be legal. A decriminalizing means instead of getting put in jail, you get a ticket. Yeah. And I mean, that's essentially what it means. And the point we're making in our team on the transpartisan world and so forth, the point we're making is that every time you make it a black and white issue, you decree that you will come up with the wrong decision. It's flat out, you'll come up with the wrong decision.
And can someone inside that, or having the transpartisan matrix inside oneself, take the position, using pornography as an example, that adults should be free to participate in it if it's consensual, but I don't think it's a good idea?
Yeah, absolutely, totally. Yeah, because see, our culture is designed to operate extra governmentally, extra formally, and all the decisions that keep things, the vast majority of decisions that keep things going are made by individuals making informed choices. That's why Jefferson said, in order for democracy to exist, you're going to have a lot of education. And so an individual could say, look, I don't think an abortion is a good idea, but I think it's worse to have a law against abortion. Why is it worse? Well, it's worse because you're very likely to have more abortions if you make a law against them than if you don't. I've worked with some of the right to life groups, and it's very interesting, and there are a lot of them very concerned about this, and there's a lot of dialogue between not a lot, but there's good dialogue between right to life, right to choice groups. And the right to life side, it's interesting because one of the points I try to make is that there are just about as many spontaneous abortions called miscarriages as there are intentional abortions. And it's roughly estimated scientifically that 3/4 of them are from environmental causes, chemicals in the environment. And in fact, when I was talking to some right to life people about it, I said, you know, there are abortions being caused right today by chemicals in the environment. And this woman said, oh my God, she was there because she'd been sprayed by I had an abortion. I had a miscarriage, a 6-month miscarriage. Mm. And so and I said, well, and she was a very feisty activist type. I said, the next time you're having a meeting about what to picket, why don't you think about picketing some chemical plants and call the public's attention to this fact? Because there is a possibility of creating a law about putting chemicals that cause abortions into the environment, that would be a transpartisan issue.
Yeah.
By the way, they went to some of the leadership in the Right to Life movement and they said, no, we don't want to do that. But that was kind of interesting.
That's unfortunate because that's, as you would say, strange bedfellows and interesting inter-issue meshing. Hopefully you'll continue pushing that conversation.
Well, it's breaking out everywhere on all kinds of issues. And, I don't know about the abortion issue at this point, but it's very interesting. If you take the abortion debate and the gun debate and lay them down side by side, they're just a complete mirror image. One side is trying to restrict abortions or ban them, and the other side is trying to restrict guns or ban them, and they're using all the same arguments for their position. And it's fascinating. There's an argument, for example, there's a whole argument that the Supreme Court upheld the Second Amendment with its Heller case here in Washington. However, since then, there have been many, dozens, about 5,000 cases in the courts about laws restricting access to guns in one way or another. 85% of them the courts have upheld. They've had a batch go to appeals courts. Appeals courts have upheld all of them. A handful, very small number, have gone to the Supreme Court. They appealed to the Supreme Court and certiorari, but they've been denied, turned down by the Supreme Court. And it was one of the justices said, what we upheld in Heller was the right of the individual to have a handgun in the home for self-defense. That's what they upheld. That could be analyzed in our law as a privacy right rather than a Second Amendment right. And they're being very, very careful. The court is very, very careful on how they look at the gun issue. And all I'm saying is that the people who argue on that the argument on the gun side, pro and con, and the argument on the abortion side, pro and con, is all around the question of mandates. Who's going to ban what? And then all the stuff starts fueling out from there.
Right. So we mentioned 5G at the beginning of this conversation, and you started getting into it, but I just kind of want to pull back and use a few examples to talk through your matrix. Talk about 5G as a general issue, that why consumers and citizens should be concerned, and then plug it into the matrix.
Well, first of all, they should be concerned because there is data suggesting that there are health problems with the 5G. It's not only, and it's important to know that 5G is a slogan. It's an advertising slogan. There is no such thing as 5G. Basically, the core technology is 4G technology, and then the government auctioned off a bunch of the frequencies at the higher end to the four major telecom companies. And so, okay, now what they say is that the Communications Act of 1997, I believe it is, the Telecommunications Act says that local communities cannot write statutes, ordinances to say where you can put towers. It doesn't say that, but they say it does, and it's all being litigated in court now, and it's going to be a huge battle. About 150 cities are in court saying that's not what the law says, and they're going after the FCC for having set up a standard. The standard that they've set up is a standard that says basically the only problem you have to worry about from EMF, electromagnetic emissions, the only thing you have to worry about in your cell phone is the heat. It gets too hot. Now, do you know that inside your cell phone it says keep it at least this far away from your head? It doesn't, and I watch people all the time going like this, but it says, and I was very, very intrigued once I heard a guy on the radio about 1995, 96 from the telecommunication industry saying this thing about cancer from cell phones is just crazy. He said, yeah, sure, a lot of people got tumors where they use their cell phone, but they were all benign. And I'm sitting here saying, holy cow, if I'm getting a tumor, I don't care whether it's benign or not. I mean, I prefer it to be benign and not benign, but I'd rather not have it at all. But anyway, so first thing is there are a series of health problems, and there's a lot of data saying there's a health problem. But the way that the scientific community has set up the regulatory science process, they're saying if the science is not conclusive, if you can't prove cause and effect, then we're going to treat it as if it doesn't have a cause and effect. that's the matrix. That's a three-part breakup that I said at the beginning.
Yep.
There's a whole middle piece we don't know, and the industry is saying we're going to treat it as if it's safe until someone proves otherwise. Now the problem with that is, of course, the day that it's conclusive, you've had millions of people exposed and probably thousands of them harmed. And there are people all over the country now being harmed. They're stepping forward. They've created a new disease identity, which is having a susceptibility to those electronic waves, and that susceptibility is now a disease. And it's estimated 4 to 6% of the population suffers from that, and now it's being treated as a minor problem because it's only 4 to 6% of the population. But once again, when you meet somebody like that, and you see what happens to them, there's a very well-known phone designer for Ericsson who back in the 90s actually would not go out of the house. He could not go out of the house without wearing an aluminum suit to protect himself. And he's got some videos online. It's kind of interesting. But these people may very well be the proverbial canary in the mine. They may be the proverbial people who are getting harmed now, when other people are going to get more and more people are going to get harmed as it gets more and more spread out. So the arguments being made at the FCC is you should be looking at non-thermal side effects. So that's one problem. Second problem, massive hacking. When you put these waves out into the environment, they're easy to hack. So again, we have a project called SafeG, and our argument is wired to the premises, wired to the home and office, wired. We believe if you wire, you'll actually have a much less hackable system. And then, of course, that translates over to national security issues because, again, a wired system is more secure. So we're saying, the fiber to the premises. We want protective stuff in the home, shielding and other things that you can do with the EMF when it gets into your home. And then there are some tighter communication systems that you can use that are more focused. An analogy would be like a laser. Now, if you put that all together as a policy, you're going to come up with a much better outcome. What we have right now is the matrix is right there, because you've got people on both the left and the right who are saying, why are we shoving this thing down the throats of the local communities? And when I say left and right, I mean they're there. Some of the, if you go into the companies, you go into the tech companies, you will find that the technical side of the companies tend to be on the side of saying, why are we shoving this down the throats of people? Where the marketing people are saying, let's shove it down their throats. And generally across the board, that tends to happen. Marketers want to shove the best business plan you can have in the world is that the government requires it. If the government requires it, you got to market. If you don't require it, then you got to go sell. And that's tough. And selling anything is tough.
Can you speak to, you mentioned that 5G is a marketing gimmick. It's actually 4G. So explain that to me.
Well, the one analysis, and when you're doing a matrix type analysis of what's going on, you have to recognize that there will be many different stories of what might actually be happening. And our argument is they all have to be considered. So one of the arguments that's being made that's important is that 4G was failing. Now, all the G means is first generation, second generation, third, fourth, and fifth. And their technology of 4G and 5G, at least for the moment, is essentially the same because they haven't done any of the technical stuff to really engage the higher frequencies. And by the way, on the wired side, we are about 17% wired. I think it's about 17%, but almost all other industrial countries are wired at 50% or more. And when we laid out our wires, they're out there back in the 90s and the aughts. We put wires everywhere, but then this is a different issue, but I mean, it's part of the story. We ended up moving the whole thing into Wi-Fi away from wired, which was a huge structural mistake. And it's going to put us way behind China. We're behind China right now largely because they have got a much tighter, more productive system than we do behind Europe too, I believe. But anyway, you've got a situation where you've got these folks that they're harmed. You've got a situation where you've got 4G operating, and remember, they're all advertising gimmicks. 4G is operating, and it's creating havoc in the culture. It is a failure on a very profound set of levels. So, for example, Uber. New York City had about 25,000 cabs when Uber began to land in the city. And Uber, there are now 100,000 Uber drivers in New York City. It's just ripping the heck out of the city. So they're going around trying to figure out how to take the old 19th century licensing system and creating something to deal with Uber. Same thing with Airbnb. Airbnb is just driving the comfort industry, the hotel industry, to distraction. And now on the large world, the large world framework, it's a good idea for people to become more and more individualized and more able to express themselves and be able to make choices of all kinds. And that's how when they were doing what they called 4G, that's how they were doing Airbnb, Uber's got scooters in Washington, all kinds of stuff like that. All these things are coming out, but their social impact was never considered. And so they were having a bad situation, and they were starting to get shaky on the stock market. I mean, it's if you're an investor, you want confidence, you want certitude, you want to be careful. You don't want to invest in something that's going to make New York City mad or Amsterdam mad or whatever. You don't want to do that. So they're shaky. So now they made up the idea 5G. This is a story that one team tells. Because they could go to Wall Street and say, put money in because you're going to have self-driving cars. You're going to be able to do cancer surgeries online. You're going to be, and they got a whole list of things they can do. But the experts that we've been talking to say that's all hype for Wall Street so that the Wall Street investors can get involved and put their money in. Now, what's interesting is the people who are full-time, always working Wall Street know the game. It's push it up, and just before it go down, sell it. That's margin call. The movie's about that.
Can you explain why 4G was a failure? I'm a little confused.
4G was a failure because it turned out a bunch of social results that were negative. I'll tell you, if you want to pursue what I'm saying, there's a whole big, wonderful promotion on the internet right now from about the book Life After Google. And the author of that book, I forgot his name right now, that author, his argument is that within the next 10 to 20 years, Google will occupy a position in the consciousness of the culture that AOL occupies right now. That basically it's going to just disappear essentially. And he has a whole set of arguments why, and they build around the fact that there was a huge error made in the beginning of the tech world, which was the notion of exploiting the identity of the individual without creating anything in return. So the individual is constantly giving. They're taking, and then selling. And he's got a whole analysis. He's got a book. He's got arguments. You can watch him on YouTube.
So 4G as a technology works. It's just that there's social cost to institutions that are utilizing it for their ends. Is that what
it depends on what you mean by works.
I mean, faster speed for downloads.
Well, it's not as fast as it being a Wi-Fi thing. It's not as fast as it would be on wired. Wired is much faster. Chinese are much faster. Most of Europe's much faster. They're having a tough time keeping up. Just in the world of tech, they're having a tough time keeping up. And we're saying a part of the reason for that is that the technology they have is a less developed technology. This is part of the whole analysis I said from the beginning, that we have large concentrated entities that are corporations in this country making decisions that are policy decisions. So they put out the 4G, 1, 2, 3, and 4G really did hype up the individual's abilities, but not nearly as much as it could have just on the bare technical competence of the actual technology. It is not as good as it could be. There are hundreds of things that are failed all over Silicon Valley that are better technically than the things that have succeeded. But they didn't have the driving, the money, the investment and so forth that the marketing guys were able to create. So what happened is they went out there without looking at the social implications, and the result was you had a mediocre technical system. And you can see it in the debate between Apple and Microsoft. Apple says we're a much more technical, better sound system. Microsoft is a much more clunky and yada yada. Well, that's essentially true from everything I can tell. But the marketers were able to sell Microsoft much better than they were able to sell the Apple computer devices. Well, what did Apple do? They come up with a telephone, and they did a different. They took all that technology of the numbers and put it into a different format, and were able to come back economically. So that would be an example where a highly advanced technology fell behind the market's forces. That's an example. But with Uber, you come up and you put 4 times as many cars on the road in New York, and in New York's going crazy with that. They're trying to pass laws to stop that. Airbnb comes in and starts making hotels go bankrupt, and people are trying to reorganize that industry. And this is how what happens when you take concentrated economic interests that can buy a technological shortcut, put it into place, and then use it to drive the society on the basis of the intrinsic power of the technology, but at the same time not get the full value of the intrinsic power because they're going after the concentrated economic power. Now, that's not a bad thing per se, but it's badly applied. Too much of the technology is being pushed aside by too much of the marketing. And by the way, that's the same thing in the cars that Nader was talking about, same thing in the food that I was talking about. It's in housing, you can see it in housing. Right across the board in our culture, we're doing that systematically. The optimums that we could have are cut short by the shortcut method to make money, basically. And it's, by the way, that's not the capitalism. Free market capitalism is not supposed to work that way.
Well, let's actually use food as an example because it just struck me. Conventional agriculture is a prime example of concentrated economic power in a select number of companies. They socialize the cost of their production to the negative health consequences to the farmers who have to wear these biohazard suits, the low nutrition density of the foods they produce, the destruction of the local watersheds, and even further down this downstream water areas are being destroyed by the excess pesticides and herbicides and such. So is that would that be an example?
Absolutely. That's a perfect example of what we're talking about. It repeats itself everywhere. Take the Boeing planes. I mean, it's amazing to look at what happened. Airbus came along with an airplane designed around a basic principle. And the principle was the United States has the best pilots in the world. They come out of basically the Navy and the Air Force. Primarily, I personally, as a Navy person, think they come from the Navy, but that's just a bias on my part. But the Navy and the Air Force turn out really good pilots that do a career and then go, however long that is, then they go fly for the airlines. And they're very skilled, they're very competent, they're very good. And Boeing builds planes for them. The Europeans are sitting over there saying, look, we've got billions of people out here who will fly, but we have to have lots and lots of airplanes to do that. And so we have to make something really simple. And so they made the Airbus. It's a really simple plane. A friend of ours, a flyer, says, listen, I get in the Airbus and I try to fly the Airbus and it's like driving a truck. It's really easy. I mean, it's not that driving a truck's easy, but it's a whole lot easier than driving a Boeing plane. And they built an entire market on that. Well, as they were coming along, Boeing's sitting there and saying, holy cow, we're going to get really undercut. And the federal government wants Boeing because it's an important defense contractor. So they made a big deal to redesign their 737. It's the same way that that one of the Ford cars was redesigned into the Corvair. Mm-hmm. And the Corvair was made longer, and it was made to drive. You could make it. It was going to be a family. Originally, it was a high-performance sports car, and they changed it slightly and made it a family car. And a lot of people weren't good enough to drive the sports car as a family car, and they started turning over and killing people. And that's how the Corvair thing developed, and that's how Nader got to be Nader. There's still a huge debate, because there are a lot of people who think the Corvair was the best car ever made, and it very well might be. It just wasn't the kind of car that the average guy or woman could drive the family to church with. I mean, and they were just, okay, so they put the Airbus out there, can be driven by relatively untrained people, and then they went all through Asia, and they found people who were smart people, good people, capable people, but they had not gotten hundreds of hours of training how to land a plane on an aircraft carrier. And so but they could fly the Airbus. It was a lot harder to fly the enhanced 737. In fact, there's an argument that's made, you'll hear it made, and you can see it made, that a really good pilot might very well have overcome the problems that caused the two crashes. When you read very carefully, you find out that the pilots in the plane that crashed in Africa, actually the plane was pulled up 12 times and pushed down by the computer 12 times. Each time a little lower, a little lower, a little lower. If you're going a little lower every time, eventually you hit the ground. But they were good pilots who couldn't overcome it. Now, there's, I think, a lot to talk about there, but nonetheless, the plane was made to be much more complex than the Airbus. And I think Boeing's just hanging on by its fingernails to make sure they don't lose the entire market, the way things are right now. That's an example of the same situation in which you could actually put a really good technology in the field and actually do something that really exploited harnessed all the potential of the technology for really valuable purposes, but it ends up with the marketers coming in and saying, no, we got to change it and move it really quickly. And that's true. Your example of food, your example of the Airbus, my example of the Airbus, this 5G is that way, the vaccine situation, they're all situations in which getting it into the market and making money off of it becomes a very important aspect of the decision making that overrides the social utility.
Well, and I would also have to add, for most, if not all, of these examples, cronyism, where you have large corporations and big government colluding together for the benefit of these large corporations, because there's that revolving door between people who sit on these boards and work for these companies, and then coming from the regulatory agencies, et cetera, et cetera. So when you mentioned, free market capitalism, these are not examples of free market capitalism.
They're the antithesis of it.
Yeah.
Because when you create a concentrated, it's basically oligopoly or monopoly, where you have a small group of people making decisions for a large market, it will always go in the direction of making more money. Every single decision that comes up and says, we can do this or make money. We can do this or make more money. We can do this or make more money. Every one of those decisions will all be based on, we'll make more money. The only way you can oppose that argument is, if we do this bad thing that's going to kill people, it is going to cost more money.
Okay.
That's the only way you can do it. Even on the Pinto, when the Pinto was burning up, there was a memo that calculated out 200 deaths from the Pinto every year. Burning up was less expensive than doing the re-engineering on the car to make it so it didn't burn. So they figured they just figured the cost of 200 lives. Okay, we can accept that, because it's cheaper than getting rid of it. And the point is that you can't have policy decisions about how society is going to run made by an individual special interest inside that society, because it will always make its decisions against, it will always make its decisions for itself, which will tend to be against the collective. And the result of that, I love it. Cleveland had a bunch of really great trolley cars. And all across the country, there were trolley cars. I think you could go from Boston to Chicago going on one trolley thing to another. And General Motors just came in and said, you know, let's get rid of those. And they did, all across the country, right out here in Washington. They're covered over track. And now we're bringing it all back, trying. That's what the metro things are all about everywhere.
Right.
So that's an example of what I would talk about there.
So let's go back to the vaccines. We have people who are going to be watching and listening to this, and they're going to think to themselves, okay, I'm better informed about the debate. What can I do to help Jim Turner and the transpartisan activists who want to have a choice when it comes to vaccines?
Well, there are all kinds of movements all over the country working on legislation. California has got the most radical mandated vaccine law. It was pushed by an MD pediatrician who's in the legislature, who was a very large recipient of campaign contributions from the drug industry. It's a very lucrative market for the drug industry. Like I say, mandate, the best market in the world you can have is have a law that says you got to use my product.
Right.
That in that situation, there are many groups in California that are working on, but there are about 40 states across the country in which there's legislation. So you want to check in your neighborhood, your country, or your state. It's interesting because now gradually the movement is starting to shift. So there are now beginning to be laws that are being pushed in states that say we want to preserve the opt-outs, and so those are now being debated. New Jersey just had a huge battle in which the opt-out, they tried to repeal the medical exemption, essentially. I guess medical and religious. They were trying to get rid of all opt-outs, and they failed. Now that's going to continue. So look in each state. There's a group called the Vaccine Information Center, which you can find online, the Vaccine Information Center. They have a rundown state by state of what the legislative battles are. That's a good place to look. There are a lot of consumer groups that are organized for consumer choice. It's really funny because the radical pro-mandate people run around and say people who are saying consumer choice are obviously anti-vaxxers. So if you see somebody using the term anti-vaxxer, you can figure they're a radical mandator. And the radical mandate movement is pretty much fueled by industry. And the question is, how do we get a sensible discussion going that says, when does the government have the right to mandate a vaccine? It does, it clearly does, if it meets certain requirements. And the question is, how are we going to get that to be the law, which is what the Constitution says, in my opinion. How do we get the laws to be congruent with that? And that's what I think the battle is in the country. And it's going on in essentially every state. And you can find anybody who wants to help on either side, as far as I'm concerned, can go find out what's going on, and then they can go out there and fight about it. But what I want to do is get people who are aware that there's an issue, and there's aware that there's information, and then start looking at the information.
Mm-hmm. So, and also, why don't you plug Citizens for Health too? How can people learn more about that?
Citizens.org.
Awesome.
Citizens.org is Citizens for Health. And we communicate 2 or 3 times a week with different issues, all kinds of issues. I mean, our basic point is, our basic premise is back in 1962, President Kennedy sent a Consumer Bill of Rights to Congress. And our basic premise at Citizens for Health is to advance that in the health area, but we think the health area covers a whole lot of things, like there's healthy housing, healthy energy, and so forth. But Citizens for Health looks at the consumer right to safety, choice, information, and redress, the right to be heard. That's what we promote. And so choice is key, then informed choice is key, and then the government steps in and protects you for things that consumers are not able to protect themselves on alone. They can't make a choice on certain things. There are certain things that you're not allowed to do, and that's auto safety stuff has been developed, and there's food safety stuff and so on. And those things are the safety piece. And then what we say is the market needs to have feedback they need to hear and listen and heed the feedback from the consumer And government needs to do that too and make policies that include consumers.
And then for 5G, if someone's listening to this and says, I had no idea that the possibility that really 4G, but marketing is 5G, has these possible negative consequences to at least 3 to 4% of the population, and perhaps, canary in the coal mine, much broader numbers of people will eventually have neurodegenerative disorders and cancer and other such things from this technology as it proliferates in our communities. What would you recommend they go do, or who should they go?
Well, we put a group together called SafeG,
okay,
which is putting out all the information we can find on all sides, and we can find it on the debate about 5G, around the premise that wired to the premises, protection in the premises, and more coherent communications in the whole system as a project, as a program, will eliminate much of the problem of health problems, hacking problems, and national security problems. I mean, that's our package, SafeG. I think you can Google SafeG at this point. If not, you will be able to soon. But it's there, and it's got a presence, and it's putting stuff out and working on issues, and it's connected to a lot of activists across the country.
Excellent. And if people want to learn more about your writings, yours and Lori's writings when it comes to transpartisan thinking?
Well, that you can go to the Transpartisan Review. Just Google the Transpartisan Review. We put out a couple of things a week on that, and we talk about we look at issues from the standpoint of the matrix, the way I'm talking about it. So the Transpartisan Review will give you an insight into the thought process that underlies all these other things.
Awesome.
And Lori Chickering, the co-editor, author, and founder of this, is very involved in something called Educate Girls Globally, which is a transpartisan educational initiative, which is an important part of what we're talking about. And that's we talk about that on the Transpartisan Review site.
All right, so I'm going to invite you back because we didn't get a chance to talk about the Quincy Institute or homeopathy. So
yeah, and the Quincy Institute is very important. You can just check the Quincy Institute and see. It was a very interesting conference. They're going to post all of the speeches and so on. And it's the idea of, and they use the word transpartisan, and they have people from all four quadrants actually were at this meeting yesterday. By the way, they didn't know they were from all four quadrants. That was what was really fun. I mean, everybody thought they had the right answer. And you look at it and you see all these arguments. I got the right, and you look at it and say, well, now if you could ever figure out how to get all that together in a policy, then you would have something approaching the right answer. And their mission is to put an end to endless war. I think that's that's roughly what they say.
Nice. Well, definitely encourage folks to check out all these various groups, sign up for the newsletters, be an informed citizen, and help move some of these transpartisan initiatives forward. Jim Turner, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. I'd love to come back on homeopathy. That's important. So give me a jingle.
Will do.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jim.
You're welcome.